Hey, everybody, welcome to Your Money Map, sponsored by the Alliance for Lifetime Income. I'm your host, Jean Chatzky. Thanks so much for being here today. If you have retired recently, well, you know it is not just a milestone, it is a seismic shift in mindset. It's swapping deadlines for endless possibilities, routine for reinvention, and of course, switching gears from accumulating to spending and trying to enjoy your money. But with so much of life being unpredictable, it becomes a little too easy to get lost in the minutia, especially when it comes to money matters as we approach those later years. My guest today is an expert in how we think about money and life in general, who says that much of what will happen in the future is, in fact, largely predictable, and that by recognizing that, we can all be better prepared for what lies ahead. Morgan Housel is the author of the blockbuster bestseller, The Psychology of Money. He's got a new book out. It's called Same as Ever. And just to tell you a little bit about him, he's been called the Mark Twain of financial writers. His books have sold more than 5 million copies. MarketWatch named him one of the 50 most influential people in the market. And today he serves as a partner at the Collaborative Fund, and I'm told is working on another new book all about spending money. Can't wait for that one too. Please welcome my guest, Morgan Housel. So nice to see you here today.
So nice to see you as well, Jean. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Is that true? Spending money is the next on the list?
That's right. I'm working on a book right now called The Art of Spending Money. I for a while I was going to keep it secret, but now I'm just might as well start talking to everyone about it. Probably won't be out for 2 years or something like that. But my first book, The Psychology of Money, heavily tilted towards investing, which has always been my passion. How do you think about greed and fear and risk? And I think that's very important in retirement investing for anyone really. But the art of spending money really just focuses on what happens at home when you are spending. A lot of it has to do with keeping up with your social status, keeping up with the Joneses, what kind of spending makes you happy, fulfillment, those kind of issues. So that's what I'm working on right now.
It's so interesting, and if we have time, I'll ask you some questions about that too, because I do think that particularly for people in retirement, one of the things that we're learning is that spending is hard depending on how you have your portfolio structured. If you've got income versus assets, it tends to be a little bit of a very different equation. But let's put a pin in that and let's talk about the new book. Same as Ever argues that the same things have really motivated humans forever. Fear, love, hate, greed, and envy, they still drive the bus. And that because of that, the future is largely predictable. When you think about history, when you think about those motivating factors, what do you think are the big lessons or the biggest lessons? Because I know there are many that we can draw for our financial futures.
Well, Gene, I tell you the inspiration for this book for me was as a financial writer for my entire career. This is something you will be very familiar with. I became a little bit peeved, upset, mystified maybe about how bad the industry was at making forecasts. Whether it was when's the next recession, when is the next bear market, what stocks should you buy? Very few, if anyone, had any repeatable skill doing that. And that to me kind of, was a big challenge. Why do we keep making predictions about the future and the economy if no one can really do it? And I think with that observation, you can do one of two things. You can become even more of a cynic and say, nobody knows anything. Don't even bother trying. Or you can focus on the things that actually might be predictable versus the things that we have no chance of trying to predict next. And so looking over history, I think one of the things that's always been very fascinating to me was how many times across history, whether it's the United States or around the world, whether it's 50 years ago or 500 years ago, that you see the same behaviors happening over and over again. Greed, fear, risk, uncertainty, it tends to be the same movie over and over again, even if the cast of characters keeps changing. So that for me was like, okay, I think there are a list of things that we cannot forecast in the future. When's the next recession? When's the next bear market? Nobody can do that. But regardless of when the next recession comes, we know how people are going to respond to it because that has never changed. It's the same today as it was 500 years ago. We don't know what the stock market's going to do next, but regardless of what it does, we know how people will respond to it because that's never changed. So the whole idea of the book was let's focus on these behaviors that never change instead of fooling ourselves into thinking that we can predict when exactly and like what specific events are going to play out in the future.
Why do you think they never change? As you were talking, I was flashing back. I have been a financial writer for my entire life as well, or so it feels, although I know I did spend some time in middle school somewhere where I was not doing this. But I was flashing back to a story that I wrote very early in my career on Forbes magazine's 75th birthday, 75th anniversary. And I was a young writer reporter there, and I wrote a story about all the bubbles of the past, all of the big ups and downs in the market, and they were things like tulips going all the way back to the 1700s. Why do you think we believe it will be different this time around?
I think we want to assume that we can learn our lessons individually or as a society. We did this stupid thing in the past. Of course, we're never going to do it again. I think what people miss is that we will not have another tulip bubble, very likely. We're probably not going to have another dot-com bubble, but there will be other bubbles. So we learn a very specific lesson from past lessons, from past crises. The lesson we learned from tulip mania, not that anyone is still alive from that, was don't pay a lot for tulips. But we did not learn the lesson of don't pay too much for an asset in general. That's a lesson that I think we will never learn. So the cast of characters again will be different. It'll be different asset classes, different CEOs, but it's going to be the same kind of greed and fear mentality, the FOMO mentality, fear of missing out, that will never go away, regardless of what the next bubble will be. I think one of the reasons it plays out is because in financial markets, the rewards for being right are extraordinary. They're off the charts. You can change not only your life, but your kid's life, your grandkids' life, if you make a great decision and make a lot of money in the stock market. Because of that, the allure and the attention that it gets is so great. But also, since the rewards are so high, people are willing to suspend a level of rational thinking that they would have in any other aspect of their life and focus on this extraordinary prize that's sitting in front of them. And that, again, was true 100 years ago. It will be true 100 years from now. So it's never going to necessarily go away. It's also the case in the stock market that the stock market in general is trying to figure out how much people are willing to pay for another asset. And the only way to really know what the boundary of that is to go a little bit beyond it. And then you're able to look back and say, okay, that was a little bit too much. So the market is always swinging from one irrational level to the next because that's how it's trying to find the boundaries of what people are willing to pay for. So a lot of times what looks like irrational behavior in the stock market actually, I think, makes quite a bit of sense. And that's one of the reasons that it keeps happening over and over again. And we don't learn these lessons, so to speak.
How do we navigate those big swings? I mean, we're not only poor forecasters of what is likely to happen in the future in terms of what the next bubble is going to be. We are, as you write in Psychology of Money, poor forecasters of our future selves. In that book, which, by the way, if people who are watching have not read, you should pick it up, borrow it from your library, do whatever you can to get a hand on it. You write, imagining a goal is easy and fun. Imagining a goal in the context of the realistic life stresses that grow with competitive pursuits is something entirely different. As you basically acknowledge, this long-term planning is harder because our goals and our desires change as time goes on. We are different people today than we will be in 30 years. It's hard for me to do something that will benefit me 20 years from now, because in many ways she is a complete stranger. So how do we navigate that and prepare for those realities in these tumultuous and volatile and bubble laden markets?
I think one answer here is that I think the best way to think about volatility in the stock market is not viewing it as a fine. A fine is you did something wrong, you're being punished because you screwed up, don't do it again. That's what a fine is. Volatility usually is not that. Volatility is a fee. It's a cost of admission that is worth paying to get something in exchange down the road, which are going to be high returns in the stock market. Once you view it as not a sign that you or your financial advisor screwed up necessarily, but as the cost of admission that if you're willing to pay, if you're willing to put up with and endure a never ending chain of uncertainty, the rewards for those who put up with it and stick around tend to be extraordinary. That little subtle mind shift is very important. The other point about how do you make a decision today when you don't know who you're going to be 20 years from now? I think the only way to have a fighting chance of minimizing that regret is to avoid the extremes of financial planning. If you have the FIRE movement on one end, save 90% of your income so you could retire at age 30, and then you have the YOLO movement on the other end, we're all like, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Like, risk all of your money on crypto. And if that's the spectrum, either end of those spectrums has a very high propensity for future regret. And I think, of course, those are the extremes. But anytime you have an extreme financial situation, I'm an extreme saver, I'm a big spender, you're increasing the odds that you're going to regret it at some point in the future. I think anytime you have a financial plan that is very bland and moderate, whether that is your saving plan or your investing strategy, you have a higher chance of actually sticking with it in the long run.
In other words, boring is better.
Almost always in investing. And that's hard for people to wrap their head around because they want to believe that complex and extreme and sophisticated is correlated with better results. And some fields it is. In finance, it almost never is.
When we're talking about the things that you write about in Same as Ever that drive people to set foot into to make mistakes, for lack of a better word, fear and greed are a couple of them, but there are also other emotions. There's love, there's hate, there's envy. How do you think about those factors, and how do you sidestep the mistakes that they are likely to lead you to make?
I think one acknowledgement here that's often very difficult for myself to accept as well is that by definition, from my analysis at least, by including these in the book, I think these will be things that will always be with us. So therefore, at the society level, we cannot sidestep them. We're always going to be driven by comparing ourselves against our neighbors and our coworkers. And therefore, that sense of envy of, well, if she has it, why don't I, is always going to be with us. And there's a lot of implications of that. You can easily imagine a world in which my children or my grandchildren are living way better than you and I in a more prosperous world. They're living longer, they have better technology, and they're no happier for it because they are comparing themselves against a world in which everyone else has those technologies as well. So at the high level, I think we can never rid ourselves of these things. That's why I think they're so important. At the individual level, it's much easier said than done. I'm not going to pretend that I don't envy people who are doing better than me or sometimes have more money than me. Everyone is human, and that's our natural inclination. I do think, though, once you recognize the game that is being played, once you recognize that even if I become way better off and I'm richer and I'm living a better life, but if my expectations grow in lockstep with that, I'm not going to be any happier for it. Just recognizing the game, I think, pushes you into taking a step back and being more grateful for what you have, even if it is so hard to keep the goalposts from moving. I think once you realize that this is just a game and not necessarily to improve your own life, but just to measure yourself against other people, just that mere recognition goes a long way. My wife and I deal with this a lot in our own life. Even after writing 2 books about the power of expectations and keeping up with the Joneses, do we do it? Of course. Of course we do. But I think because we are just thinking about it, once we find ourselves in that situation of saying, oh, wouldn't we be happier if we had that person's house or that person's car? We have a moment of that, but it makes it easier to take a step back and say, no, not necessarily, or maybe very marginally happier. But what's actually going to make us happy is our marriage, our
Mhm.
children, our health. So maybe let's try to use our money to bolster those things rather than trying to keep up with a group of strangers.
Well, and also I found it helpful as I'm listening to you, because of course I do this in my own life too, to reframe a bit. I went to the gym this morning. I go to this gym where it's semi-private personal training. So for every four people in the class, they add another trainer. And there are people in there that lift a ton of weight. And I am not those people, right? But once I discovered the other people around my age group in the class, the other, almost 60-year-olds, and started comparing what I could do to what they could do, I didn't feel like such a loser, right? I felt a little better because I was just not casting such a wide net. And I sometimes think if we can qualify this human tendency to compare ourselves to other people, which is just something that we do all the time, we come out a little better.
Of course. And I think a lot of that too is the grass is always greener fallacy because I think very often in that specific example, the big heavy weightlifter might be looking at the smaller person in the gym saying, I wish I had her flexibility. I wish I had that. And
Well, I don't have that either.
that's just, well, but that's just in the gym. I think it's always that grass is greener mentality is very, very powerful. There's a great quote that I love from Montesquieu, and he said this 300 years ago. So this is something that's always been true. He said, if you only wish to be happy, that is very easy to accomplish. But people wish to be happier than other people. And that is very difficult because we assume that other people are happier than they actually are. And so it's so common to look at someone and say, oh, they look so happy. They look so content. And a lot of times we're just massively inflating because we're only seeing a very small sliver of that person's life. And without really realizing that that person, even if they're not maybe looking at you necessarily, they're looking at other people and sizing themselves up relative to everyone else.
One of the things that's so interesting to me about retirement and retirees is that when we look at people, they do tend to get a little bit happier and a little bit less acquisitive as they age. They tend to have a little bit less FOMO. What is that?
I have my own theory about this, and I'm not going to pretend that this explains all of it. But here's my theory for why life satisfaction tends to be a U shape. You're pretty happy as a kid. You kind of have this trough in middle age, and then you tend to get pretty happier in your older years. Not for everyone, but in general, that's what we see. One of my theories for this is that really what that is portraying is inequality, not just inequality of income, but inequality of health and lots of things. When you are young, most of the time, everyone is kind of in decent shape. Maybe everyone has acne when they're a teenager. Even the things that are negative, basically everyone is in the same boat. Middle age, you tend to have a massive divergence of outcomes. Some people are very wealthy. Some people are very poor. Some people are in very good shape. Some people really start to lose it physically in their 30s. And then in older age, you start to have this like all the outcomes start to converge again. Whether you are rich or poor, your body's going to start deteriorating. You're going to get wrinkles. You're going to lose your hair. Your back's going to hurt in the morning. So when you're comparing yourself against your peers, those outcomes start to converge again. Now, I think this is just a minority of why that U-shaped happiness exists, but I think it's a big part of it, that we are naturally always comparing ourselves against other people. And when we are very young or very old, we tend to look around and say, everyone else who's like me is in the same boat that I am. But when you're in your 40s and 50s, you look around and you say, wow, there are some people who are doing way, way better than I am right now. And that leads to a lot of discontent.
So interesting. In psychology, in The Psychology of Money, you write that the entire concept of being entitled to retirement is at most 2 generations old. And essentially, we have to cut ourselves some slack because when it comes to saving and investing for retirement, we're not crazy. We're just all new at this. Can you walk us through your thinking on that?
It's very hard for people to not even remember, but even to comprehend this. But as recently as the 1950s, not that long ago, the majority of people worked until they died. And yes, there was Social Security after the 1930s, but it was very much designed to be a safety net to keep you out of destitute poverty. It was not designed to be a proper pension in any sense. And there is kind of a meme, this idea that, well, everyone had a private pension back then, and it's not even remotely true. Uh, the number of retirees who had access to a private pension peaked at about 25%. And the amount of money they got from those pensions tended to be very low. So this idea that everyone or virtually everyone should have a dignified 10, 20, 30-year retirement is really unique to about the last 40 or 50 years. It's a very new concept. I mean, the Roth IRA didn't exist until 1998. And the 401k, the IRA, really didn't come into widespread use until the late 80s, early 90s. These are very new concepts. And one takeaway from that is, of course, people are not good at it. They don't have any generational knowledge transfer of what you're supposed to do. A lot of things in life you learned from your parents learned from their parents. There's generational knowledge transfer. We by and large don't have that because the baby boomers are really the first generation ever where society told them the expectation was you save for your own retirement and best of luck to you. And you're supposed to retire at age 65, even though you might live until 85 or 90. And so you need to save for your own retirement and keep yourself going for a quarter of a century. That is a brand new thing. So you are right to use the word cut ourselves some slack because we're just figuring this out, for the first generation. You can reasonably expect that 2 or 3 generations from now, my children, my grandchildren will be way better at this than we are because they will have learned from mistakes. They'll have more historical data to go off of.
We're actually seeing that, right? If you look at if you look at the data on Gen Z and on some of the younger millennials, we're seeing that they are in fact better at the saving portion of retirement, right? They're better at putting money into their 401ks, in part because people who study behavioral finance have figured out that if you automate them into making those contributions, you'll have a much greater chance of success. So auto enrollment, auto escalation, target date funds have gotten us a long way as far as those early savers are concerned. But the people who are in their 50s and their 60s, the peak 65 generation, are now being asked to do something that nobody has ever done. They're being asked to take the money that they've saved and make it last over this incredibly, potentially long period of retirement. When you think and look at the psychology that is required to do that, what have you learned about people who are likely to succeed versus not?
I think one of the biggest issues here, and this is hard for a lot of people to discuss because it's not something that if they came to terms with it, they would be very happy with, which is that it's not just that we are new at retirement, but the expectations of what a decent retirement looks like have massively inflated. So the amount of money that a lot of people think that they need or that they demand, the lifestyle that they want to live, is much more inflated than it used to be. The anecdote that I always use, and it's an anecdote of one person, is my grandmother-in-law, who was a child of the Great Depression. And even after the Great Depression, they were very poor for their entire life. She lived for 30 years on nothing but Social Security. She did not have a pension. She didn't have any savings. She got $1,700 a month from Social Security, and she was the happiest person you will ever meet. But she was very content with that extraordinarily slim, no-frills life. And I think it's a product of a growing and more prosperous economy that today very few people would have her attitude to say that I could live a decent life off of $1,700 a month. Very few people would have that attitude. They have expectations for a grander lifestyle, and that's great. But the inflation of expectations and aspirations makes it that much harder to clear the bar of how much money you need for retirement and making that money last. And so that's a tough problem for people to come to terms with, that there's like wealth is always a two-part equation. It's how much money do you have, and what is that money in relation to your expectations? And it's the gap between the two that makes you prepared for retirement. And for a lot of people, the ability to have a good retirement means managing both ends of that. It's not just growing your money, it's growing your money and keeping your expectations in check at the same time.
There are a number of studies that have pointed to the fact that when you look at American adults, fewer than half have taken the trouble to figure out how much they are likely to need in retirement based on their current standard of living. When you think about managing those expectations, is running those numbers sooner rather than later an important part of the process? And do you think that we don't run the numbers because we want to be able to have these inflated dreams?
I think for a lot of people, I think it's easy for people like you and myself who have a financial education, a financial background, to assume that everyone else will grasp the numbers that we need. But I think for most people, even if they were an educated person and a very bright person, if you ask them to calculate the net present value of what they're going to need over a 25-year period, would stop and say, "What did you just say?" It's not. So it's less about being scared to calculate the numbers, but just having, just being able to grasp even what that means, like the net present value of what you will need over a 25-year period in an annuity or in a portfolio that pays dividends, I think is a very difficult thing. And I also think, back to our point earlier about not knowing who you are, I think there will be a lot of people who even in their 50s and 60s will say, I need to save for travel in my retirement because I want to do a lot of travel. And then they might realize that by age 80 or earlier, they're really not up to it anymore.
Right.
But what is going to change are their healthcare expenses. And so I think it's very difficult. It's common, I would say, to look at your lifestyle today and just extrapolate that into the future, even though who you are and what you desire and what your expenses are going to change dramatically over the course of your retirement as well.
You spend a lot of time in the psychology of money talking about luck and risk. And we've done studies. The Alliance for Lifetime Income has done studies over the years that has shown, and this is by far not the only study to point to this, but that the risk of running out of money in retirement is the biggest worry that many people have. It's a particularly big fear for women. One of the ways we know that people can reduce that risk is by starting to think about buying themselves a paycheck, paying for an annuity or an income stream um, that will work in parallel with Social Security, because that's an annuity too, in order to secure at least your fixed cost. And yet, very few people actually do this. Do you think that's because? Well, why do you think that is?
I think at least one of the reasons, and I want to be careful with my words here because I think the vast majority of people who work in the financial services industry are good, honest, well-meaning people. But I think there is a earned and deserved skepticism of annuity products because the fees in some situations that can be charged are egregious. And in many situations, that's not the case. I'm not throwing annuities under the bus in the slightest. But I do think a fair number of people come at it with a level of skepticism that is understandable. I also think the concept of an annuity in general is hard for people to wrap their heads around. Of people understand savings accounts, they might understand bonds, but conceptually an annuity of I give you this money or I pay you this money and you give me a paycheck for life is harder for them to wrap their heads around what exactly that means. And so I think that's at least part of where this comes from in terms of getting people to take a step, to take an action that might be very advantageous for them, but getting over that fear factor.
Um, as you are digging further and further into your research on spending, on the book that comes next, what are you learning? Just to give us a sneak peek, what are you learning about the way that we do spend versus the way that we maybe should spend?
I think at the very high level, money can be used for two things. It can be used as a tool to give yourself a better life, or it can be used as a yardstick in which to measure yourself against others. And I think the more I dig into it, I'm astonished, maybe not astonished, but it's just fascinating to see how much of spending in today's modern economy is the latter. It's doing something not because it's making your life more pleasant or more comfortable or more enjoyable or more fulfilling. It's doing it because you are using it to measure yourself against other people, either to keep up with other people or to show yourself that you are in some way superior to those other people. And that might sound like a very cynical way to frame spending money, but the more I dig into it, I'm astounded at the extent to which I do it and my wife does it. It's a very natural thing to want to keep up with, if not surpass, other people. That has been ingrained in us for as long as there have been humans. It will be with us for as long as there will be humans. But when you frame it as money is a tool to live a better life versus a yardstick to keep up with other people. To me, it's a very refreshing kind of way to think about how I spend my own money. And I think just in writing the book, I think about that a lot with myself. And do I want to buy this thing? Do I want to go on this trip because it will make me happier or because it will make me feel better about my position relative to other people? If you ask yourself with everything that you spend, I think it's astonishing how often you come up with, I think my desire for this is the latter. But of course, the life that I want to live is using this money as a tool just to live a better life, regardless of what other people are doing.
Endlessly fascinating. Morgan, thank you so much for doing this with me today. Thank you for giving us your time and such an interesting conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jean.
And if you're looking for more information on this program, you can find it at protectedincome.org/Housel. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next time.